Mission accomplished. President Trump's verdict after the US, Britain and France hit Syria's government with more than 100 missiles. Calls for restraint and accusations of aggression as the UN Security Council meets to discuss the strikes. President Assad's supporters put on a show of defiance in Damascus while state TV shows him walking calmly into work. US President Donald Trump has praised American, British and French missile strikes against the Syrian government as perfectly executed and mission accomplished. It's their most significant attack against President Bashar al-Assad and the first coordinated retaliation for last Saturday's suspected chemical attack on Douma. Washington and its closest allies launched more than 100 missiles targeting a scientific research facility in Damascus and 2 chemical weapons storage facilities near Homs. One was also a military command center. Syria says it shot down 13 incoming missiles over Damascus, while its ally Russia says Syrian forces intercepted 71 cruise missiles throughout the country. The strikes are currently being discussed at yet another heated UN Security Council meeting, this one called by Russia. So we'll bring you the latest from there in a moment. First, though, Aljazeera's Zaina Khodr is in Beirut looking at the reaction in Syria to the missile strikes.
Celebrations in the streets of the Syrian capital and a message of defiance from government supporters, hours after US-led airstrikes were described as the tripartite aggression. The strikes didn't come as a surprise. For days, the US and its allies were discussing their options. That allowed the government to evacuate military installations and potential targets. At the end, the operation lasted for less than an hour. It was limited to destroying what the Pentagon said was Syria's chemical weapons infrastructure. In the words of the U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis, a one-off shot.
The strike was executed in a way that doesn't allow the Russians, particularly, or not to put the Russians in a very difficult position and push them to retaliate. So I think everybody, I said it before, everybody seems to have been relieved, and some seems to be happy because the strike was not as bad as the rhetoric was a few days ago.
The Western alliance said the strikes were about deterring the use of chemical weapons. But the Syrian opposition leader Nasser al-Hariri wants an end on all attacks against civilians by the Syrian government. On Twitter, he said, maybe the regime will not use chemical weapons again, but it will not hesitate to use weapons. This was never about regime change, nor was it about reducing the Syrian government's military strength. And it's not just about punishing the government for the alleged use of toxic materials.
The main issue is Iran's presence in Syria, so this whole crisis has to be seen in this political context. This time they didn't target Iran because they wanted to avoid escalation. But the issue about their presence has not gone away, especially for Israel.
Israel has been targeting Iranian assets in Syria for some time now. Iran said 7 of its Revolutionary Guards were killed in the latest suspected strike on the T4 airbase. It's promising retaliation. The risk of confrontation between the U.S. and Russian militaries may have now receded, but the possibility of a showdown between Israel and Iran is still on the table. The Iranian-backed Lebanese group Hezbollah, which is fighting alongside the Syrian government, says there is a new phase following the attack on the T4 airbase. Israel, it says, is now in a state of direct confrontation with Iran. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei denounced the leaders of the US, UK and France as criminals following Saturday's strikes and said they won't achieve any gains. There were fears of a wider conflict if Russian, Iranian and Hezbollah forces were targeted. The pro-Syrian government alliance is declaring victory, but this is not the end of the crisis. For Bashar al-Assad, arriving for work on Saturday, it appears he wanted it to look like business.
In a powerful show of allied unity, we deployed 105 weapons against 3 targets that will significantly impact the Syrian regime's ability to develop, deploy, and use chemical weapons in the future. The precision strike was executed with France and the UK, demonstrating our unquestionable resolve. I'd like to close by noting that since the strike, we have not seen any military response from actors within Syria, and we remain postured to protect our forces and those of the coalition should anything occur.
Well, Mike Hanna is live for us at the United Nations, and we saw the usual tensions playing out at this meeting, Mike, with fighting talk from US Ambassador Nikki Haley and the Russian representative Vasilina Benja, very much echoing sentiments that we heard from President Putin earlier on.
Yes, indeed, and also sentiments that we've heard in the Security Council chamber throughout the week. Remembering this is the 5th emergency session of the Security Council on the issue of Syria that we've seen. This one called by Russia and Bolivia. We understand that Russia will be introducing a resolution on which there will be a vote condemning the action by the US, France and Britain in carrying out these strikes against Syria. But from the Russian ambassador, we heard hostile and vehement criticism of the action of the Western allies.
The United States, supported by its allies, launched airstrikes against military and civilian targets in the Syrian Arab Republic, without a mandate from the United Nations Security Council and in violation of UN norms and principles of international law. An aggression against a sovereign state was carried out. In an act of cynical disdain, a group of Western countries decided to take military action without waiting for the results of the investigation. Russia condemns the attack against Syria in the strongest possible terms.
Well, from the UK ambassador, we heard a justification for the strike in terms of international law. From the French ambassador, we heard a pledge to unity with the US and with the UK. And then from the US ambassador, she said that every effort is being made to reach a diplomatic solution.
We acted to deter the future use of chemical weapons by holding the Syrian regime responsible for its atrocities against humanity. The strikes were carefully planned to minimize civilian casualties. The responses were justified, legitimate, and proportionate. The United States and its allies did everything we could to use the tools of diplomacy to get rid of Assad's arsenal of chemical weapons. We did not give diplomacy just one chance. We gave diplomacy chance after chance.
Well, we also heard from the US ambassador that there could be more strikes should Syria carry out any other alleged chemical weapons attacks. Her quote was, "President Trump is locked and loaded." Back to you, Mariam.
Well, there you go. Thank you very much from the United Nations, Mike Hanna, with all the latest on that UN Security Council meeting. Want to get...
I think that's pretty much exactly the case. We've heard exactly the kind of rhetoric that we would expect from the Russian representatives in the United Nations. We've heard exactly the kind of rhetoric that we would expect from Vladimir Putin, who posted a statement on the Kremlin's website earlier on today. And we've heard exactly the kind of rhetoric that we would expect from various other members of the Russian diplomatic leadership, like the foreign ministry and ambassadors to the US, etc., which is, essentially saying that this is an illegal action from the United States and Britain and France, that they didn't clear it through the UN Security Council, that they didn't even wait for the OPCW to finish its fact-finding mission on the ground in Syria. It's there at the moment and is planning to visit Duma very shortly. So, yeah, that's what we would expect from this kind of scenario. But if you dig past all that, what does Russia feel about all this? Well, I think that Russia is actually looking at the facts, what was actually hit in Syria last night, and is thinking this could have been a whole lot worse. Think back to the beginning of the week and all that hot talk that was being thrown around with, the ambassador to Lebanon saying that, Russian ambassador to Lebanon saying that, they would shoot out of the sky any US missiles that came anywhere near Syria and strike back against the platforms that launched them. Of course, those platforms would be US warships and US planes, UK planes as well. We haven't gone anywhere close to that kind of scenario. We're in a position where this was a limited strike. It was specifically targeting at facilities that the West believes have been involved in Syria's chemical weapons program. We haven't had anything that threatens Russian assets on the ground, Russian military lives. We haven't had anything that threatens Iranian assets or military lives either. So this is a scenario that could have been a whole lot worse than it was, and it seems like the deconfliction mechanisms that are in place between Russia and the United States have worked to a certain extent, and cooler heads have perhaps prevailed in Washington, D.C., with the defense establishment persuading Donald Trump to maybe back away from what he was possibly planning earlier in the week. And now we're in a position where the Russians are looking at this and thinking, this is a cost I think we can bear.